Hello, viewers. Today we will be exploring the impacts the adoption of Bitcoin had on El Salvador. To start, let's spend a minute going over context. What is Bitcoin and what does El Salvador's economic history look like before it? Well, like many of its neighboring Latin American countries, El Salvador's economy historically relied heavily on agricultural exports, primarily coffee, sugar, and indigo, during and much after the Spanish colonial rule. In fact, El Salvador's economy remained agricultural dependent throughout the mid-20th century's industrialization, which, if anything, only accelerated growth and further asserted an export-oriented agriculture. Growth, along with the country's economy, infrastructure, and social fabric, was very unfortunately devastated during a 12-year civil war starting 1979 and ending 1972. The war started as public disapproval of extreme poverty, land inequality, which is obviously super important to an agricultural dependent economy, and political repression of these very outcries. In turn, the government abused people's human rights using military force and death squads, greatly thanks to US aid and its fear of a communist takeover, resorting to recruiting, or more well said, forcing young boys to be soldiers as soon as they turned the age of 12. As a result, the guerrilla rebel group, now political party, Farabundo Martí Nacional Libertarian Front, received support from Cuba and the Soviet Union. I meant what I said when I used the word devastate. To paint you guys a picture, there was frequent massacres of civilians, forced disappearances, and torture on both sides. What is the economical result of such a tragedy? The answer is all types of economic instability, from government budget deficits to economic uncertainty, thus discouraged investment, to sky-high inflation, meaning loss of purchasing power. The result was an overall weak financial system, such that Salvadorans couldn't access credit or stimulate economic activity. Enter 2001 dollarization, attracting foreign investment by reducing risk and of elimination of currency devaluation, alleviating many of the previously mentioned effects of inflation. This adoption of the US dollar was a good quick fix, but didn't resolve the underlying issues of poverty and inequality. The poor, although surviving and no longer in the middle of a civil war, were still poor with limited opportunity to escape the cycle. Additionally, the Salvadoran economy now experienced fluctuations concurrently to the US, and there was nothing the Salvadoran government could do in terms of monetary policy tools. Dollarization meant that they had lost monetary policy autonomy. Today, many people still don't have access to a bank, but do have access to cell phones. Enter Bitcoin, the first cryptocurrency to exist. Cryptocurrencies are defined by the goal of building a decentralized, largely unregulated version of Wall Street on the blockchain. But what is blockchain? Simply put, they are fancy Google Sheets or Excel sheets with a key difference and purpose being they are public permanent databases that nobody, like a government or a Google, owns. Anyone can inspect a public blockchain's code or see a record of any transaction. Cool, right? How is this related to El Salvador? Well, in 2021, the Salvadoran president, Bukele, adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, aiming to boost financial inclusion. In other words, give Salvadorans access to credit, secure savings accounts, insurance protecting individuals and businesses alike from illness, accidents, or property damage, all with Bitcoin's initial goal of thwarting total government control over money in mind. But wait a second. How does that last one benefit the people or the government? From the government's perspective, people's loss of trust in them wouldn't immediately lead to an economic crisis. And from the people's perspective, financial privacy is a guarantee, appealing to a societal value we'll be discussing later on. Now that we're experts on El Salvador's economic and even political history, as well as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, let us analyze some of these effects and of this adoption. The effects on the economy were limited. Bukele's government allocated the equivalent of 15% of its annual investment budget to try ingraining Bitcoin into the national economy. It offered $30, nearly 1% of what an average Salvadoran earns in a year, to every citizen who downloaded a government-backed cryptocurrency payment app called Chivo Wallet. Mr. Bukele claims that nearly 3 million Salvadorans, or 60% of adults, heeded to his call. Yet, after the initial uptake, the use of cryptocurrency has plunged. Only 10% of those initial Chivo users continued making Bitcoin transactions on the app after spending their $30 stipend. According to a national survey conducted by three American-based economists in February, then published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, almost no new customers downloaded the app after this incentive. A separate survey by El Salvador's Chamber of Commerce in March found that only 14% of the country's businesses made Bitcoin transactions since it was introduced 7 months prior, and only 3% said they perceived any business value in it. At a macro level, this was a failure as well. A research article titled Cryptocurrencies and Capital Flows: Evidence from El Salvador's Adoption of Bitcoin, published August 2024 in the Applied Economics Letters, found that international capital flows declined after El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, possibly due to increased uncertainty, inexperience, or a shift to unrecorded financial activities. This is important because a lack of capital flow means reduced investments or funding entering or leaving the country, slowing economic growth and limiting financial resources. Bringing us to our second effect. What was the social thought? What societal values in Salvadoran society were exemplified by this major event? In truth, it doesn't get any better than the last effect. Quick side note. There has been a major Salvadoran public approval of a mass incarceration effort led by Bukele, where authorities have arrested roughly 75,000 people suspected to be gang members, including 7,000 who were eventually released due to being wrongfully detained, basically profiled, and thousands more who are not gang members but remain jailed and are thus reportedly being tortured and deprived of food, according to human rights groups. Based on what we learned earlier from their civil war and what we know now about the approval of the mass incarceration efforts, it is obvious that Salvadorans value safety, stability, pragmatism, and overall skepticism and critical thinking toward the government as a means of collective and community well-being. According to a New York Times article titled El Salvador's Adoption of Bitcoin is Off to a Rocky Start, a majority of Salvadorans polled August 2021 by local newspapers said they were against El Salvador's adoption of Bitcoin. Nearly three-quarters said they would not accept the digital currency as payment. Only about a third of Salvadorans even use the internet. Clearly, there was much resistance, and based on the low number of users after the government's $30 incentive previously mentioned, It's obvious that this event solidifies pre-existing societal values. In that same New York Times article, it's reported that many, approximately 1,200, took this resistance to the Capitol streets, chanting "No to Bitcoin." Among those protesters were judges and magistrates. Whether or not groupthink played a role here, it's obvious Salvadorans won't adhere to all their government says, even if they largely approve of them. As a matter of fact, Bukele has been one of the most successful presidents in terms of public approval. According to another New York Times article titled El Salvador's President Claims Election Victory in a Landslide, the president won re-election this year by 85% against five other candidates, among them being a member of that Civil War's guerrilla rebel group turned political party, who, by the way, had dominated Salvadoran politics for 30 years pre-Bukele initial election. Even with all that, an established approval of the president and an approval of his policies, no matter how the rest of the world thinks of them being inhumane, Salvadorans clearly are very true to these values, even if it means going against the advice of a leader they themselves refer to as the world's coolest dictator. I think it's pretty obvious. Groupthink is not playing a role here. If anything, the variability or volatility Salvadorans' opinion is proving a very objective way of thinking. The third effect of this first of its kind event is introducing ambitious environmental aspirations to El Salvador and putting it on the agenda of the country's president. According to a research article titled Economic Freedom or Crypto Colonialism, Materialities of Bitcoin Adoption in El Salvador, published in May 2024 in GeoForum, author Ruchi Patel explains how Bukele has proposed the idea of Bitcoin City, a tax-free zone at the foot of an extinct volcano. He hopes new Bitcoins can be mined there using geothermal power from the volcano. For reference, there has been much speculation in previous years as to how energy consuming mining Bitcoin is. According to a 2021 New York Times article, though Bitcoin mining may not involve pickaxes and hard hats, it's not a purely digital abstraction either. It's connected to the physical world of fossil fuels, power grids, and emissions, and to the climate crisis we're in today. The Bitcoin network, which is close to 0.5% of all electricity consumed in the world, uses about the same amount of electricity as Washington State does yearly. More than a third of residential cooling in the United States uses up, and more than 7 times as much electricity as all of Google's global operations. Whether or not Bukele achieves this utopian-like idea of a city, which he often compares to the Greek city of Alexandria, with him obviously being Alexander the Great, it is clear that he sees an opportunity for El Salvador to be an example, a leader even, in the global pursuit of becoming a nation pioneer of a renewable energy-driven society. In conclusion, El Salvador's bold experiment with Bitcoin has yielded a mixed bag. While aiming to provide financial inclusion and economic growth, the practical implementation hasn't caused any major devastation as of now, besides a dip in capital flow. But it hasn't gained the everyday Salvadoran anything. The widespread adoption of the population has been sparse, and the most opinionated response has been against it. On the bright side, proving the weight of the societal values of many Salvadorans. The environmental implications of Bitcoin mining, especially in a country like El Salvador, has raised concerns, but also unconventional, creative even, ambitions. Ultimately, the long-term impact of this 3-year-old decision remains uncertain. But from what we can see is that technology has the ability to play a pivotal role in shaping not only countries' economic strategies, but also societal values and environmental aspirations. El Salvador's journey with Bitcoin exemplifies the power and the challenges in utilizing technological innovation in addressing modern day issues. I hope you learned something new. Thank you for listening.